The restaurant was quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that made every small sound seem louder than it actually was. The air smelled faintly of baked bread and coffee, mixed with the soft fragrance of flowers that sat on each table. Outside, the city was already alive with the rush of evening traffic and the distant sounds of people chatting and laughing. But inside, the restaurant felt like a different world. There was a calmness to it, a softness that made it easy to forget the chaos outside. Among the staff, one young waitress moved through the tables with a gentle efficiency. She was not someone people noticed at first. She didn't have bright clothes or flashy jewelry. Her hair was tied back simply, her shoes practical, and her smile polite but not attention-grabbing. She had been working at the restaurant for several years, enough that she knew the routines by heart. She knew which customers liked their coffee hot, which ones preferred their desserts with extra whipped cream, and which regulars enjoyed small talk. She moved quietly, almost like she was part of the background, blending into the rhythm of the place. That evening, she felt a strange mixture of fatigue and anticipation. She had been on her feet for hours, taking orders, carrying trays, and making sure that everything ran smoothly. There was a certain satisfaction in her work. She liked seeing satisfied smiles when people enjoyed their meals, but sometimes it felt repetitive. Tonight, however, something felt different. There was a subtle energy in the air, a kind of expectant tension that she couldn't quite explain. She brushed it off as nothing, thinking that perhaps it was just the evening crowd, slightly larger and more animated than usual. The restaurant was hosting a small gathering, a mix of regulars and a few visitors who had come for the special menu of the day. The tables were arranged neatly, white tablecloths and polished glasses reflecting the soft light of the hanging lamps. In the corner of the room stood an old piano, its wood slightly worn from years of use, but still shining with a kind of quiet dignity. Most people barely noticed it. Occasionally, the restaurant hired a pianist to entertain guests. But tonight, the piano sat unused, quietly waiting for someone to bring it to life. The waitress had noticed the piano many times before. She liked to glance at it when she passed by, imagining the music it could make. Sometimes, when the restaurant was empty, she would hum softly to herself, imagining herself playing a melody, her fingers dancing across the keys. No one ever knew about these moments. She never mentioned them. To the world, she was just the quiet waitress, always moving efficiently, never asking for attention. But inside her, music was always present, like a soft heartbeat, steady and constant dot. As the evening progressed, more guests arrived. The chatter grew, and the smell of food and coffee mingled in the air. The young waitress continued her work, taking orders and refilling glasses, moving from table to table with practiced ease. She noticed the smiles of the guests, the laughter, the small gestures of appreciation when someone said, "Thank you." It was comforting to be part of these little moments, to witness people enjoying themselves. And yet, a small part of her longed for something more, something beyond carrying trays and serving plates. It was during this quiet but lively moment that one of the event organizers approached her. He was a tall man, slightly formal, and he had a kind smile that made people feel comfortable. He leaned down slightly and spoke to her in a tone that was meant to be light, almost teasing. "Would you play something on the piano for us tonight?" he asked, with a hint of a smile that suggested it was more of a joke than a serious request. The waitress froze for a moment. She had never been asked to perform publicly in this restaurant, and certainly not by someone so direct. Her heart skipped a beat, and a flush of nervousness ran through her. She looked at the piano, its polished keys gleaming softly under the light. She swallowed hard, feeling a mix of fear and excitement. It was one thing to imagine playing alone in the quiet of the empty restaurant. It was another thing entirely to play in front of a crowd, with eyes watching her every move. "Me?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She felt the heat rise to her cheeks, unsure of how to respond. The organizer nodded, still smiling. Yes, you. Just a simple melody. Nothing fancy. Just something nice for everyone to enjoy. He clapped his hands lightly, as if to encourage her. Go on, it'll be fun. The waitress hesitated, her fingers brushing against her apron as she tried to steady herself. She glanced at the guests, some of whom were already looking toward the piano with mild curiosity. No one seemed to expect a great performance. Most of them probably thought it would be a cute gesture, a brief moment of entertainment before returning to their conversations. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the nervous flutter in her chest. Slowly, she walked to the piano. Each step felt heavier than the last, but she moved with a quiet determination. She sat down on the bench, the wood creaking slightly under her weight. She placed her hands gently on the keys, feeling the smooth surface beneath her fingers. The room seemed to quiet down, as if sensing the anticipation of what was about to happen. Even the clinking of glasses and soft murmur of conversation seemed to fade into the background. She began to play. The first notes were simple, just a few soft tones that echoed gently through the room. Her fingers moved with care, almost hesitantly at first, but each note was clear, precise, and filled with a gentle warmth. The melody was simple, something anyone could hum along to, yet there was an elegance to it, a softness that made the room feel more alive. Guests turned toward her, curious now, their attention drawn to the unexpected moment of music. As she continued, something began to change. Her nervousness started to fade, replaced by a quiet confidence that came from a deep familiarity with the instrument. Her fingers moved more freely across the keys, finding patterns and harmonies that seemed to flow naturally. It was as if the piano had been waiting for her all along, responding to her touch in a way that made everything else disappear. She felt the music in her body, each note resonating through her, connecting her to the room and to the people who were now listening. A few guests whispered to each other, surprised by the skill and grace of her playing. She's really good, one murmured. Listen to that, said another. The chatter had stopped completely now, replaced by the sound of music that filled the entire space. The waitress noticed the change, feeling a quiet thrill. She had never played for an audience like this before, and yet it felt natural, as if she had been preparing for this moment all her life. She added small flourishes to the melody, subtle decorations that made the simple tune more intricate and beautiful. Her eyes were focused on the keys, but she could sense the presence of the audience behind her. She felt no fear, only a calm clarity, a connection to the music that seemed to lift her above the ordinary world of serving tables and cleaning spills. The piano was no longer just an instrument. It was a voice, speaking for her in ways she had never found words to express. Time seemed to stretch as she played. The room had transformed from a casual gathering into a space where everyone was present in the moment, listening, feeling, and experiencing the music. Even the staff paused for a moment, caught by the beauty of her performance. The clatter of dishes and the soft hum of conversation faded completely. There was only the piano and the melody that flowed from her hands, carrying a sense of emotion that touched everyone in the room. The young waitress, once invisible, now felt a presence and a recognition she had never known. It was not about applause or praise yet. It was about being seen, about being acknowledged in the quietest, most profound way. She felt a gentle pride, a warmth that spread through her chest, knowing that something inside her had been noticed, something that was always there, but had remained hidden. For the first time that evening, she allowed herself to imagine a different world, a world where music was not a secret hobby, but a part of her life that others could share, a world where she could step beyond the quiet corners of the restaurant and let her talent be known. And yet, she stayed in the moment, focused on the music, letting each note guide her and fill the room. The final notes of this simple melody lingered in the air, soft and gentle, like a whisper. The audience remained silent for a heartbeat, caught in the beauty of what they had just heard. Then slowly, small claps began, polite at first, then growing louder as more guests realized the skill and emotion that had filled the room. The young waitress sat back, her hands resting on the keys, breathing steadily. She smiled softly, a mixture of relief and quiet joy washing over her dot. No one had expected this. She had played something simple, yes, but the way she had filled the room with her music was unforgettable. The quiet waitress, who had spent so many days moving unnoticed through the restaurant, had become the center of attention in the most unexpected way. She had not sought it, but the music had carried her there, showing a side of herself that even she had not fully realized. As the applause continued, she felt a small thrill of excitement and possibility. Maybe this was just the beginning. Maybe the music inside her was meant to be shared, to touch others, and to transform ordinary evenings into moments that no one would forget. She took a deep breath, letting the sound of clapping and soft murmurs of admiration fill her ear. After the applause had faded, the young waitress felt a mixture of relief and surprise. She had expected polite claps, maybe a few smiles, but the way the room had reacted was different. Guests were still looking at her, some whispering quietly to each other, their faces lit with genuine curiosity and admiration. It was a strange feeling, being noticed not for the way she served food or managed tables, but for something she had kept inside for so long. For years, she had loved music quietly, playing only when no one was around. And now, in a single moment, the world had turned toward her. The event organizer, still smiling, approached her again. "That was wonderful," he said, his tone now filled with sincere appreciation. "I didn't expect that at all. You have real talent." The waitress felt a flutter of nerves at the compliment. She lowered her eyes modestly, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her apron. Compliments had always been difficult for her. She was used to blending in, to staying quiet, and now the attention felt overwhelming, but also strangely exciting. A few guests began approaching, offering small words of encouragement. "You played beautifully," one said. "Do you perform often?" asked another. The young waitress shook her head gently, smiling shyly. "Not really," she admitted. "I just enjoy playing when I can." She wasn't used to speaking about her music to others. For her, playing was private, a secret joy that no one needed to know about. But the evening had changed that. For the first time, she realized that her music could reach people, could touch them in ways words sometimes could not. The organizer, sensing the shift in her confidence, leaned closer. "If you're willing, maybe you could play a little more." "Just for fun," he said, a playful spark in his eyes. "Something a bit more complex, maybe?" "I think the guests would love it." The request caught her off guard. She had just played a simple melody, nothing more, and now he was suggesting something more difficult. Her heart raced. She felt the old nervousness creeping back, the familiar self-doubt. Who was she to play something more complicated? She was just a waitress. She didn't perform professionally. And yet, as she looked at the piano, something inside her stirred. It was a quiet voice she had ignored for years, telling her that she could do more, that her music could go further. She hesitated, then slowly nodded. "Okay," she said softly. "I'll try." The words barely left her lips, but they felt like a small victory. She took a deep breath, placing her hands on the keys once more. The room seemed to sense her decision. Guests leaned forward slightly, sensing that something new was about to happen. The first notes of the new piece were cautious, careful, as if testing the waters. Her fingers moved with precision, finding the rhythm and melody in a way that seemed effortless to those watching. The music was more intricate now, the tune more layered, more alive. With each note, she felt herself growing more confident, more connected to the piano. The melody started simple, but soon began to expand, filling the room with sound that was both powerful and gentle at the same time. Some guests exchanged glances, impressed by the unexpected depth of her playing. "She's amazing," whispered one woman, her eyes wide. "I've never heard anything like this," said another man, leaning closer to listen. The young waitress felt a thrill run through her as she played. She had never performed for anyone before, not like this, not with all eyes on her. And yet, in a strange way, it felt natural. The music seemed to guide her hands, each note leading to the next, as if the piano itself knew what she wanted to say. As she continued, the melody became more expressive. Her fingers danced across the keys, sometimes soft and tender, sometimes bold and commanding. The music seemed to take on a life of its own, growing and evolving in ways she hadn't consciously planned. She was no longer simply playing notes. She was telling a story, speaking with the language of sound. The room was transformed. Conversations had stopped entirely. Even the clatter of dishes and the soft hum of background noises faded into silence, leaving only the piano and the young waitress's music. For the first time, she noticed the faces of the guests in the audience. Some had closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them, while others watched in awe, unable to look away. There were smiles, nods, and even a few tears glimmering in the corners of eyes. People who had come expecting a casual dinner were now witnessing something extraordinary, a moment that felt almost magical. The young waitress felt a surge of emotion herself, a mixture of fear, joy, and wonder. She was not used to being at the center of attention, but the music made her feel alive in a way she had never experienced before. The organizer watched with wide eyes, impressed beyond measure. He had thought it would be a small, entertaining moment, a light performance to amuse the guests. But what he was seeing now was something entirely different. The young waitress had taken a simple request and transformed it into a performance that no one could have anticipated. There was skill, yes, but more than that, there was emotion, expression, and an undeniable presence that filled the room. It was clear that this was not just a casual player. This was someone with a gift, a rare talent that demanded attention. Encouraged by the positive energy, she allowed herself to explore the music further. She added subtle variations, tiny improvisations that made the melody more intricate and alive. Her hands moved with confidence now, no longer hesitant. Each note was precise yet full of feeling. The room seemed to hold its breath with her, every guest attuned to the smallest shift in rhythm, the faintest change in tone. The young waitress felt a deep connection to everyone present, as if the music had built an invisible bridge between her and the audience. A few guests who were regular musicians themselves began whispering in awe. "Look at her technique," one said quietly. "Her touch is incredible," another remarked. They could see the control, the subtlety, the emotion she put into each note. Some had played instruments themselves, and they understood that this was not just talent, but also passion, practice, and a natural sense of musicality. The young waitress, unaware of the technical details, simply let the music flow from her heart, guided by feeling and instinct. Time seemed to lose meaning as she continued to play. Minutes passed like seconds, and still the melody expanded, carrying the listeners along on an emotional journey. There was a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat, a flow that rose and fell like waves, gentle one moment, strong the next. The room felt suspended in time, caught entirely by the music. It was as if nothing else existed, only the young waitress and her piano, sharing something deeply human and profoundly moving. Some guests began to lean closer, entranced. Others simply sat back, letting the music reach them without trying to analyze or understand. There were smiles, nods, and a few quiet sighs of wonder. One older man, sitting near the back, whispered to his companion, "I've never heard anything like this." "She's extraordinary." The young waitress, immersed in her performance, did not notice the whispers, the glances, or the silent admiration. She was fully present in the music, letting it guide her, letting it speak for her in ways words never could dot. As she played, she felt a strange but wonderful sense of freedom. For the first time, she was not just the quiet waitress, the invisible part of the restaurant's background. She was someone who could create beauty, someone whose presence could transform the atmosphere, whose skill could touch hearts. The realization was both humbling and exhilarating. She had always loved music, but now she understood that it had the power to connect, to inspire, and to transform the people around her. The melody began to reach its climax, a series of notes that rose and fell with increasing intensity. Her fingers flew across the keys with a grace and precision that seemed almost effortless. The audience was spellbound. Some leaned forward in their chairs, unable to contain their awe. Others closed their eyes, letting the sound carry them away. The young waitress, lost in the music, felt a rush of emotion, a mixture of joy, fear, and amazement. She was no longer playing for herself alone. She was playing for the entire room, and the connection was electric dot as the final notes echoed softly into silence. The room stayed still for a heartbeat, as if no one wanted to break the spell. Then slowly the applause began. At first it was quiet, polite, but it grew steadily, filling the room with a sound that was warm, sincere, and enthusiastic. The young waitress sat back on the bench, her hands resting on the keys, her chest heaving slightly from the effort and emotion. She looked up at the faces around her, meeting eyes full of admiration, amazement, and genuine appreciation. The organizer came forward, his expression one of wonder. "That was incredible," he said simply. "I don't think anyone expected that. You've turned this evening into something truly special." The young waitress felt her cheeks flush, a mixture of pride and humility washing over her. She smiled softly, unsure of what to say, simply nodding in response. The applause continued, a warm embrace of sound that made her feel seen, recognized, and valued in a way she had never experienced before. For the rest of the evening, the atmosphere in the restaurant was different. Guests were energized, talking in low, excited tones, exchanging glances and whispers about the performance they had just witnessed. Even those who had been there simply for a meal seemed transformed, carried along by the beauty of the music. The young waitress moved. The night had settled fully over the city outside, but inside the restaurant, a quiet excitement lingered, like the echo of her earlier melody still vibrating in the air. The young waitress had returned to her duties, moving between tables with the same careful attention as before, yet something had shifted in her posture, her expression, her presence. She was no longer invisible. Every movement carried a subtle confidence, an unspoken energy that made the patrons look at her differently. It was as if the music had quietly revealed a new layer of herself, one that she had kept hidden for years. The guests who had been present for her brief performance lingered at their tables, whispering to each other, casting glances toward the piano every now and then. A few of them had risen from their seats, walking closer, as though drawn magnetically to the corner where the instrument stood. They did not know exactly what had captivated them, but they felt a pull, an unspoken desire to witness more. Among them was an amateur musician, someone who had spent years learning piano and music theory. His eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that was almost palpable, and he whispered under his breath, "There's something extraordinary here. You can see it in her hands. She isn't just playing. She's alive in the music." The young waitress felt the weight of that attention. She was aware of it, yet she did not let it frighten her. Instead, it stirred something deeper within her, a quiet determination, a readiness to explore the music further. Her fingers itched to return to the keys, to continue the story she had begun earlier. She walked slowly, almost reverently, toward the piano once more. The room seemed to pause as she approached, the soft rustle of movements fading into an expectant silence. Even the staff behind the counter seemed to hold their breath, watching the quiet waitress step into a role she had never imagined for herself. As she sat down, she allowed herself a moment to look at the keys, letting her fingers hover above them. There was a familiarity here, a comfort she had never spoken about. Each note seemed to call to her, inviting her to bring it to life. She began slowly, softly, testing the melody as if speaking the first words of a conversation. But then, without conscious thought, the music began to grow. The notes gained depth, flowing with a natural rhythm that seemed to emerge from somewhere beyond her mind. It was not planned, but it felt inevitable, as though the piano and her hands had known each other all along. The audience felt it immediately. The first few notes were gentle, but then the melody began to rise, richer, fuller, more expressive. People leaned forward instinctively, drawn into the subtle power of the sound. It was no longer simply a performance. It was a conversation between her and the room, a sharing of emotion without words. Every chord carried a story, every pause a delicate breath that held meaning beyond explanation. Guests found themselves holding their own breath, caught in the invisible web she was weaving with music. Some of the patrons closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them. One older woman rested her hand lightly on her chest, feeling the rhythm echo in her heart. A young man at a nearby table glanced repeatedly at the pianist, mesmerized, as if he had never truly listened to music before that night. The amateur musician could barely contain his awe. He whispered to a companion, "She's a natural. Look at the way her hands move. She's not just playing the piano. She's speaking to us. You don't see this often. This is real talent." The young waitress felt her own pulse quicken. She had never played with such intensity before, yet every note felt as though it had always existed, waiting for her to release it. She was no longer thinking about the audience, the room, or the applause. She was thinking only about the music, about the story she wanted to tell, the emotions she wanted to share. Her fingers moved with precision, but also with passion, each touch of the key deliberate, yet free, fluid, and alive. The piano seemed to respond to her in kind, as if it were an extension of herself. As the melody evolved, it began to take on complexity that surprised even her. Harmonies intertwined seamlessly, shifts in rhythm created tension and release, and delicate variations added layers of depth that made the simple tune almost unrecognizable from the one she had begun with. The young waitress was aware of this transformation, yet it felt natural, as if the music itself was guiding her hands. She did not force it. She let it unfold, allowing each note to follow the previous one, each phrase to lead into the next, creating a story that was alive and breathing in real time. The audience was spellbound. The atmosphere in the restaurant had transformed entirely. It was no longer simply a place to eat and converse. It had become a living space filled with sound, emotion, and quiet wonder. The guests were not merely listening. They were experiencing. Some had tears in their eyes, moved by the beauty and intensity of the performance. Others were sitting rigidly, their attention completely absorbed, feeling the power of the music in ways they could not articulate. Every person in the room was connected, united by the invisible thread of sound that the young waitress had spun from the piano. A few of the more musically trained guests leaned forward, studying her technique in awe. They recognized subtle flourishes, delicate dynamics, and the precise control of tempo. Yet beyond the technical skill, there was something else, something intangible, something that went far beyond notes on a page. It was emotion, expression, and authenticity, all conveyed effortlessly through her playing. They realized that she was not merely performing. She was creating a living, breathing piece of art in real time, one that responded to the mood of the room, to the unspoken reactions of her audience. The young waitress, absorbed in the music, noticed none of this. She was fully present, completely immersed. She had forgotten about herself, about her position as a waitress, about the everyday routines she followed. In that moment, she was only her music. She felt liberated, as though she had been carrying a hidden flame inside her all these years, and now it was blazing freely. Each note became a word, each phrase a sentence, each chord a paragraph in the story she was telling, without uttering a single syllable dot as the melody progressed. She allowed herself to experiment further, exploring the instrument in ways she had only done in private, in the quiet corners of her room. She played with dynamics, contrasting soft passages with sudden bursts of intensity, creating tension that resolved into beautiful, flowing harmonies. She improvised small motifs, weaving them seamlessly into the main theme, surprising herself as much as the audience. The piano had become a partner, not just a tool, responding to her touch, echoing her intent, and amplifying her emotion. The room was utterly silent, except for the sound of the piano. Even the clinking of glasses, the occasional cough, and the low murmur of conversation had disappeared. Guests were suspended in a shared experience, connected in a moment of beauty that transcended the ordinary. They could feel her presence, her dedication, and her vulnerability. Some were crying quietly, moved beyond words. Others were holding their breath, afraid to disturb the fragile magic that had taken hold of the room. It was clear that the young waitress had become more than a performer. She had become a conduit for something larger, something profoundly human. The amateur musician could not resist approaching closer, his eyes fixed on her hands. He whispered to the person next to him, "I've never seen someone like this. Look at the control, the emotion, the way she makes the piano speak. She's extraordinary. She could go anywhere with this talent." The others around him nodded, sharing his amazement. They had expected a simple melody, a brief moment of polite entertainment, but instead, they were witnessing the emergence of a hidden genius, someone who had been quietly living among them without recognition. The young waitress herself was unaware of the impact she was having. Her mind was fully occupied with the music, her body moving instinctively, her fingers finding patterns and harmonies that seemed to emerge from nowhere. She allowed herself to feel every note, to let it resonate within her, to use the piano as a voice for all the thoughts and emotions she had kept silent for so long. The music carried her beyond the confines of the restaurant, beyond the daily routines of her life, into a realm where she could be fully herself, unafraid, unjudged, and completely a live dot as the performance reached its climax. The room seemed to vibrate with the intensity of her playing. The melodies soared, filling every corner with sound, wrapping around each guest, drawing them in, holding them in a state of shared wonder. She played faster, then slower, soft then loud, with a control that seemed effortless, yet was clearly the result of years of unseen practice and innate musicality. The music told a story without words, communicating joy, longing, hope, and vulnerability all at once. By the time the final notes faded into silence, the room was transformed. Guests were still sitting, stunned, some with tears in their eyes, others with smiles that could not be contained. The young waitress exhaled deeply, a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and quiet triumph washing over her. She had given everything she had to the music, and in return, the room had responded with awe, admiration, and recognition. For the first time, she felt seen not as a waitress, not as someone who simply served tables, but as a person with a voice, a presence, and a talent that could touch the hearts of many. The applause began slowly. The room remained alive with energy, buzzing in a quiet, almost reverent way. Guests sat, eyes still wide with wonder, as if trying to grasp the moment that had just unfolded. Some had tears on their cheeks, others had hands pressed lightly to their hearts. The young waitress had returned to her duties briefly, but the feeling of awe in the air followed her like a shadow. She moved from table to table, refilling glasses, taking plates, all with a calm smile. Yet she could feel the invisible thread of attention following her every step. The evening had begun as an ordinary night, but it had changed in ways no one could have predicted. As she moved through the restaurant, the whispers began again, softer now, but filled with awe. "Did you hear that? She's unbelievable. Her fingers, they move like she's part of the piano itself. I've never heard anyone play like that." These words floated through the room, blending with the fading melody that seemed to linger even after she had stopped playing. Guests glanced at each other, nodding silently, sharing a mutual understanding that something extraordinary had taken place. The young waitress could hear them, but remained humble, feeling a quiet warmth in her chest. She had not sought this attention, but it felt oddly comforting. Like the first sunlight after a long winter, the event organizer, still standing near the piano, caught her eye. He smiled and gestured toward the instrument. "Would you perhaps continue?" he asked, his voice careful, almost reverent. The guests, they seemed enchanted. "I think they would love to hear more." The young waitress hesitated, a familiar flutter of nerves washing over her. She had already shared more than she had expected to, and now the idea of continuing in front of so many people was daunting. But then she glanced at the piano, its polished keys shining in the soft light, and felt a pull that she could not ignore. It was as if the instrument itself was calling her back. Slowly, she walked toward the piano, the room growing quiet in anticipation. Guests shifted in their seats, leaning forward slightly, sensing that something even more remarkable might be about to happen. The amateur musician, who had been observing her closely, whispered again to a companion, "I think she's about to surprise us all. There's something in her playing that isn't ordinary. She's exceptional." The words hung in the air, and many around him nodded in agreement. The young waitress felt a shiver of nervous excitement, but she allowed it to settle into a quiet determination. She sat at the piano once more, her fingers hovering above the keys for a brief moment. Then, almost instinctively, she began to play. The first notes were gentle, delicate, almost a whisper. But as she continued, the melody began to shift, gaining depth and complexity. It was no longer simply a simple tune, or even a slightly more complex piece. It was a story, a journey that seemed to flow naturally from her mind, her heart, and her fingertips. Each note carried emotion. Each phrase conveyed a feeling that words could not express. The audience felt it immediately. Some guests closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them completely. Others watched in awe, unable to look away. Even the regulars who had seen her perform earlier were caught by surprise. The music was growing, evolving, filling every corner of the room with a richness that seemed almost tangible. The young waitress played with confidence now, fully immersed, allowing the piano to speak for her in a way that was both powerful and delicate. She was no longer simply performing. She was creating an experience, an emotional landscape that everyone in the room could feel. The amateur musician whispered again, almost breathlessly, "This isn't just talent. This is genius. She's extraordinary. Look at the way she interprets the music, how it flows naturally, effortlessly. This is beyond skill. She's remarkable." His companion nodded silently, eyes wide, completely absorbed in the performance. Around them, the other guests were similarly captivated. Some had tears in their eyes, some held their hands to their hearts, and others simply sat still, unable to process the beauty they were witnessing. The music had transformed the room, lifting it beyond the ordinary into something almost sacred. The young waitress herself was caught in the music. She had lost track of time, of the people watching, even of herself. The piano had become an extension of her being, a voice through which she could communicate all the thoughts, emotions, and dreams she had kept inside for so long. Each note, each chord, each subtle variation was filled with intention, with meaning. She played not for recognition or applause, but because she had to, because the music demanded it, because it was a part of her dot. As the performance continued, the melody began to reach new heights. She added flourishes, gentle improvisations that blended seamlessly with the main theme. The music moved from soft and tender passages to powerful, commanding sequences that made the audience sit forward in their chairs. Each shift in rhythm and tone was deliberate, guiding the listeners through a journey that felt both personal and universal. The piano seemed alive, resonating with her every movement, echoing her emotions back to the room, creating a connection that words could never convey. Guests began to whisper again, this time not in disbelief, but in reverent admiration. It's like she's telling a story through the piano. Every note, every pause. It's perfect. I've never felt music like this before. The atmosphere was electric, yet gentle, filled with a shared sense of wonder. Even the regular staff of the restaurant, accustomed to evening crowds and casual entertainment, were captivated. They watched her, mesmerized, realizing that this quiet, unassuming young woman had just transformed the evening into something unforgettable. The young waitress felt herself rising with the music, her confidence growing with each passing moment. She had always known she loved music, but she had never imagined the power it held to move others so profoundly. Every chord she struck seemed to connect her with the people in the room, to touch something deep within them, to awaken emotions that had been lying dormant. She felt a quiet pride, not in herself, but in the gift she had been entrusted with, the ability to bring beauty and emotion to others through her hands. The audience responded instinctively. Some rose from their seats, unable to contain their awe. Others remained seated, eyes closed, swaying slightly with the rhythm of the music. The room was filled with an energy that was almost tangible, a shared experience of beauty, emotion, and human connection. The young waitress felt it too, sensing the way the music resonated not only within her, but throughout the room. She played on, guided by feeling, instinct, and the invisible conversation she was having with every person present. The amateur musician could not contain his admiration. He leaned closer to a friend and whispered, "Do you see what I mean? This isn't just talent. This is rare, extraordinary. She's transforming the evening, the entire space. It's breathtaking." His friend nodded silently, equally mesmerized. Around them, similar reactions could be seen. People were quiet, almost reverent, moved by a performance that was so much more than expected. It was as if they were witnessing a revelation, a glimpse of something profound that could not be described in words. The young waitress, fully immersed in her performance, began to add subtle variations that made the melody even richer. She played with dynamics, moving from soft, tender passages to bold, intense sequences, creating a journey that pulled the listeners deeper into the music. Each note seemed to speak directly to the heart, conveying emotion, storytelling, and connection. She was no longer just a waitress or a performer. She had become a storyteller, a conduit for the music itself. Time seemed to blur. Minutes passed like seconds as the audience sat entranced. The ordinary sounds of the restaurant, the clatter of dishes, the soft hum of conversation had vanished. There was only her music, filling the room, wrapping around every guest, touching everyone in a deeply personal way. Some had tears in their eyes, some held their hands to their hearts, and some simply sat in awe, unable to move, caught in the beauty of the moment. The climax of the piece approached, and the young waitress, allowed herself to play with even more intensity. Her fingers flew across the keys with precision and grace, each note ringing out clearly, yet full of emotion. The melody rose and fell like waves, gentle then powerful, carrying the listeners on a journey that was both personal and universal. The piano seemed to respond to her completely, resonating with every emotion, every subtle movement, every intention. The room was alive with sound, yet quiet in a way that demanded attention. Respect and awe. As the final notes faded, the room stayed silent for a heartbeat, suspended in the beauty of what had just occurred. Then, slowly, the applause began. It started small, polite, almost hesitant, but it grew steadily, until the entire restaurant was filled with clapping, cheering, and shouts of admiration. Guests rose to their feet, some laughing in disbelief, others wiping away tears, all celebrating the quiet, unassuming young woman who had transformed an ordinary evening into something extraordinary. The organizer approached her once more, eyes wide with awe. I can't believe that just happened," he said. "You've turned this evening into something unforgettable. Everyone here, they're amazed. You've touched something in all of us. That was incredible." The young waitress smiled softly, hands still resting on the keys, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment. She did not seek praise, yet it was comfort. The applause still lingered in the room, a warm and vibrant echo that seemed to follow the young waitress as she moved among the tables. Her hands rested briefly on the edge of the piano, the faint memory of the notes she had played still resonating in her fingers. The room had been transformed by her music, and the guests were not yet ready to let go of the magic. Some were still seated, their faces reflecting wonder and amazement. Others had risen, standing in small groups, talking quietly, trying to process the experience they had just witnessed. The young waitress felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. She had given everything she had to the performance, yet she felt no emptiness, only a quiet satisfaction. As if a part of her soul had finally found expression, the organizer approached her again. More serious now, his usual playfulness replaced by awe. "I have to be honest," he said, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I never expected that. No one here did. You've taken what was meant to be a small, charming moment and turned it into something extraordinary. People are still talking about it, and I can't stop thinking about it myself. That was more than music. That was magic." The young waitress smiled softly, brushing her fingers lightly across the keys. She was not accustomed to such direct praise, and it made her feel both humbled and deeply grateful. Word of her performance began to spread almost immediately. A few of the guests, clearly impressed, approached her tables afterward, eager to express their admiration. "You have to be a professional," one said, leaning in, eyes wide with excitement. "There's no way someone can play like that without years of training." The young waitress shook her head gently, a soft smile on her lips. "I've practiced a lot, yes," she said, "but mostly on my own. I never performed for anyone before tonight." The guests looked at her in disbelief, unable to reconcile the shy, quiet woman before them with the remarkable music that had filled the room. Others were similarly struck. Some complimented her technique, others the emotional depth of her playing. One older man, who had been sitting near the back, approached and said quietly, "You've touched something inside all of us tonight. I haven't felt anything like that in years. You have a gift, a rare gift." The young waitress nodded, feeling a warm sensation spread through her chest. She was not used to being recognized in this way, but it felt good, honest, and real. For so long, she had hidden her music, believing it to be just a personal joy. Now she began to understand that it could have meaning beyond herself. As the evening wore on, more people gathered near the piano, not out of curiosity, but out of admiration. Some of the regular guests had returned to their tables, telling friends and family about what they had witnessed. A few who had arrived late asked if they could hear more, and the organizer, sensing the continued excitement, nodded toward the young waitress. "Would you maybe play just a little longer? Everyone here would love it," he said softly. The request made her pause. She was tired, physically and emotionally, but there was a spark inside her that told her she could continue. She glanced at the piano, the familiar keys glinting under the soft lights, and felt a quiet determination settle over her. She sat down once more, placing her hands on the keys, and let the music flow. This time, she allowed herself to experiment further, letting her fingers follow instinct and emotion. The melody became richer, more layered, and the music seemed to wrap around each person in the room, connecting them in a shared experience. Some closed their eyes completely, swaying gently to the rhythm. Others watched her with rapt attention, their breaths caught in quiet wonder. Every note seemed to resonate in the air, filling not only the room, but the hearts of those who listened. The amateur musician, who had been observing intently from the corner, could barely contain his excitement. He leaned toward a companion and whispered, "I've never seen anything like this. Look at how she improvises, how every note flows naturally. She's not just playing the piano, she's telling a story that reaches all of us." Around him, others nodded, sharing in the awe. Some could not stop whispering, their voices tinged with disbelief. The young waitress, immersed in the music, remained unaware of the details, focused entirely on expressing the story she wanted to tell. As the performance continued, the energy in the room deepened. The music was no longer simply a melody. It had become a living presence, moving through each guest, drawing out feelings they had not even realized were there. People felt a strange mix of joy, nostalgia, and longing as the notes unfolded. Some wiped away tears silently. Others leaned forward, completely absorbed. The atmosphere had shifted entirely from that of a quiet, ordinary restaurant to something almost sacred, a space where music spoke louder than words ever could. The young waitress allowed herself to feel each emotion fully. She was no longer playing out of duty or expectation. She was playing out of pure expression, letting the piano carry her feelings outward. Each chord was deliberate, yet natural. Each pause intentional. Every crescendo a reflection of the intensity she felt within. She was no longer merely a waitress. She had become a storyteller, a voice for the music that lived inside her, sharing it with the world in a way she had never dared to imagine. Guests began to murmur again. Softly, their words a mixture of amazement and gratitude. "It's like she's speaking to my soul," one whispered. "I can't believe someone like her exists," another said. "She's so humble, yet so powerful." The room seemed united in a collective awe, a shared recognition of a talent that could not be ignored. Even the regular staff, who were accustomed to routine evenings, felt a sense of wonder that made them pause, their work momentarily forgotten as they witnessed something extraordinary. As she played, she noticed small interactions among the guests. Some reached for each other's hands, holding them loosely, their faces reflecting the depth of emotion stirred by the music. Others whispered softly, describing the sensations they felt. She could see the impact her music had on them, the way it moved through the room, creating a bond between people who had previously been strangers. The realization filled her with a quiet pride and a sense of responsibility. Her gift was not just for herself. It could touch lives in ways she had never imagined. The organizer watched in amazement, unable to take his eyes off her. He leaned toward a guest and whispered, "This is more than entertainment. This is something rare, something that doesn't happen often. She's transformed this entire evening, this whole space, with her music." The guest nodded, eyes wide. Others in the room nodded in agreement, some holding their chests, as if the music had reached deep into their hearts. The young waitress, unaware of their words, continued to play, guided solely by instinct and emotion, fully immersed in the act of creation. As the performance approached its final passages, she allowed herself to become even more expressive, letting her fingers flow freely across the keys. The melody rose and fell, soft and tender, then bold and commanding. The music seemed to carry the weight of years of hidden emotion, of dreams that had been tucked away, of moments she had never shared with anyone. Each note resonated, creating a connection with the audience that was profound and moving. People felt the story in the music, responding with quiet sighs, tears, smiles, and applause. When the final notes faded, the room stayed silent for a moment, suspended in the afterglow of what had just occurred. Then, slowly, the applause began. At first, it was soft, hesitant, polite, but it grew steadily until the entire room was filled with clapping, cheering, and shouts of admiration. Guests rose to their feet, some laughing in disbelief, others wiping tears from their cheeks. It was not just polite acknowledgement. It was heartfelt appreciation, a recognition of the extraordinary talent that had transformed their evening. The young waitress sat back, hands resting on the keys, heart racing from the intensity of the performance. She felt exhausted yet exhilarated, overwhelmed yet fulfilled. The room had witnessed something rare, and she had been the one to share it. For the first time, she realized that her music had the power not only to entertain, but to move, to connect, and to inspire. The applause continued, washing over her like a wave of warmth, confirming that the gift she had always kept private could touch lives in ways she had never imagined. Guests began approaching her once more, eager to express their admiration. "That was incredible," one said. "I've never experienced anything like that in my life." "You have to perform professionally," another insisted. "There's no way someone can play like that by accident. You're meant to share this talent with the world." The young waitress shook her head softly, smiling humbly. I just love playing," she admitted. "I never imagined it could have this effect." Yet deep inside, she knew that this was only the beginning. The organizer stepped forward again, his expression a mixture of amazement and pride. "You've changed this evening, this restaurant, and the experience of everyone here," he said quietly. "I think this is the start of something extraordinary for you. You have a gift, and it deserves to be shared." The young waitress felt a wave of gratitude and quiet determination. She had discovered something essential about herself. Her music was not just a private joy. It was a gift meant to touch others. And now she was ready to embrace that truth. By the time the last guests had left, the restaurant felt The days after that unforgettable evening passed in a blur for the young waitress. The restaurant returned to its usual rhythm, yet nothing felt the same. Guests now looked at her differently, some with recognition, some with quiet admiration. People who had attended that night returned with friends, insisting they sit near the piano to witness the young waitress at work, even if it was just a casual meal. The atmosphere in the restaurant had changed. It was no longer simply a place to eat and drink. It had become a space alive with possibility, where even a single melody could transform an ordinary evening into a memory people would carry with them for years. News of her performance began to spread in ways she had never anticipated. Word of mouth moved quickly. Friends of guests shared the story, describing the young waitress who had surprised everyone with her piano talent. "You have to see her," one person would say. "She's just a waitress, but when she plays, it's like magic." Soon, the small local newspaper caught wind of the story. A reporter arrived one afternoon, notebook in hand, curious to witness for themselves what had captivated so many people. The young waitress felt a mix of nervousness and excitement. She had never been interviewed or featured before. She was just someone who loved music, The reporter approached her gently, careful not to overwhelm her. "People are talking about your performance last week," they said. "Can you tell me what inspired you to play that evening?" The young waitress hesitated, fingers lightly brushing the piano keys. She smiled softly, unsure how to explain something so personal. I just love playing," she said quietly. "It's something I've always done, even when no one is watching. That night, I felt like the music wanted to be shared. I didn't plan anything, I just played." The reporter nodded, understanding in their eyes. They could see that her gift was genuine, unpolished in the public eye, yet deeply authentic. Soon after, the newspaper story was published, and interest in her talent grew even further. People began visiting the restaurant specifically to hear her play. Regular diners were delighted to discover that the quiet waitress who always served their tables had a hidden talent that could captivate hearts. Invitations began arriving from small music venues, private gatherings, and community events. They wanted her to play, to share the same magic she had shared that evening. The young waitress felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. She had never imagined performing outside the familiar comfort of her workplace. Yet she knew she could not ignore the opportunities opening before her. One evening, as she prepared for her usual shift, a well-dressed woman approached the restaurant manager. She introduced herself politely and asked to speak with the young waitress. The woman explained that she was a music teacher and had heard about the performance through mutual contacts. "I've been searching for someone with a special gift," she said. "Your playing is extraordinary. I would like to offer you lessons and guidance if you're interested. I think you could go far with the right training." The young waitress was stunned. She had never considered formal training. Music had always been a private part of her life, something she explored quietly, without expectation or ambition. And now, someone was offering her a path she had never dared to imagine. The next days were a whirlwind of meetings and small performances. Every time she played, people listened with genuine admiration, some moved to tears, others cheering spontaneously. The young waitress learned to trust herself more, discovering new techniques and ways to express her emotions through music. She spent hours practicing, exploring her own potential, realizing that the piano was not just a hobby, but a doorway to something greater. Her confidence grew with every note, every melody, and every audience reaction. She began to feel a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. During this time, the young waitress noticed how her music affected people in ways she had never expected. Some came to the restaurant just to hear her play, seeking solace or inspiration. One elderly man, who had been sitting in the corner for several evenings, told her quietly, "Your music reminds me of hope I thought I had lost." "It's more than talent, it's healing." A mother brought her young daughter, who had never heard live piano before, and the child's eyes widened with wonder as the young waitress's fingers danced across the keys. Each interaction strengthened her sense of responsibility and humility. She realized her gift was not only for herself, but for the world, and she could use it to touch lives in meaningful ways. One evening, after a particularly moving performance, a local music promoter approached her. "I've been following the buzz about your talent," he said. "I'd like to invite you to perform at a larger venue with a proper audience, where more people can experience your music. I think the world deserves to hear what you can do." The young waitress felt a rush of nerves. Performing in front of a larger audience was intimidating. She had always played quietly, carefully, with humility. But deep inside, a spark of courage ignited. She realized that music was meant to be shared, and she could no longer hide behind modesty. She accepted the invitation, her heart pounding with anticipation. The night of her first public performance arrived. The venue was much larger than the restaurant she was used to, filled with strangers who had come specifically to hear her play. She stepped onto the stage quietly, glancing at the grand piano before her. The lights dimmed, and the murmurs of the audience faded into a tense, expectant silence. She took a deep breath, placed her fingers on the keys, and began. The first notes were soft, tentative, but as she continued, they grew into the same expressive, flowing melodies that had captured the hearts of so many in the restaurant. The audience was spellbound. They listened in silence, completely absorbed by the music. The young waitress felt the familiar rush of emotion and connection, the way music could speak without words. She allowed herself to explore each melody, improvising, adding nuances and subtle shifts that conveyed her deepest feelings. Every chord resonated with the listeners. Every pause drew them in closer, and every rise and fall of the melody held them captive. She realized that this was the moment she had been preparing for all her life. The moment where her music could truly reach the world. By the end of the performance, the audience erupted in applause, standing in unison to acknowledge the talent and passion of the young woman who had begun as a humble waitress. She felt a mixture of awe, relief, and joy. The applause was louder and more overwhelming than anything she had experienced before, yet it carried a deep sincerity, a recognition of the beauty she had shared. For the first time, she truly understood the reach of her music, the power it had to connect, inspire, and move people in ways words never could. In the weeks that followed, opportunities continued to grow. Invitations arrived from larger venues, private events, and even music competitions. She began to collaborate with other musicians, learning new techniques and discovering the depth of her own potential. Yet despite her growing fame, she remained humble and grounded, never forgetting the small restaurant where her journey had truly begun. A piano had always been her closest companion, her sanctuary, and she made sure to honor that connection in every note she played. She also began to mentor younger musicians, sharing her experiences, her love for music, and the importance of expressing oneself honestly. She encouraged them to explore their talents without fear, to embrace mistakes, and to find their own voice. Through teaching, she discovered that her gift was not only about performing, but about inspiring others to find their own courage and joy. Each time she guided someone through a melody or helped them discover their rhythm, she felt the same joy she'd experienced in her earliest performances. One evening, she returned to the restaurant, now transformed into a local landmark for music lovers who wanted to hear her play. She sat at the piano and began a simple melody, the same gentle notes that had first captivated the restaurant's audience. Guests listened quietly, some with tears in their eyes, others with soft smiles. She realized that no matter how far her journey took her, the essence of her music remained the same: honest, heartfelt, and deeply human. Her life had changed dramatically, but the connection she felt to the music, to herself, and to the people around her had only grown stronger. Through all the opportunities, performances, and recognition, the young waitress never lost sight of why she played. Music was her voice, her story, and her gift to the world. It had given her courage, purpose, and a way to touch the hearts of countless people. And as she looked out at an audience, listening in rapt attention, she knew that every note she played was not just sound. It was a bridge between souls, a shared experience of emotion, and a reminder that beauty could emerge from the most unexpected places. Her journey had begun with a single evening, a simple melody played quietly in a restaurant. Yet it had grown into a life filled with music, connection, and new possibilities. She had transformed from a humble waitress into a recognized musician, yet she remained grounded, humble, and human. The world had discovered her talent, but she had discovered herself. And in that discovery, she found a new beginning, a life where her music could continue to inspire, heal, and uplift everyone who listened. The young waitress had learned that courage often begins with a single step, a willingness to share,